The Nelli Stevenson Show is recorded on Wurundjeri country. Today's episode is brought to you by the fact that we kicked big tobacco out of schools, but somehow decided that big gas deserved to stick around. From big tobacco to big oil, when you have a really harmful product, you don't change your product, you change the story. Today's episode looks at a really important land-breaking report from Comms Declare that found that 260 programs existed to indoctrinate Australia's children into the world of fossil fuels. They're currently calling for a Senate inquiry to ban advertising to children about fossil fuels and to put an end to these programs. Today's guest is the wonderful Belinda Noble from Comms Declare. Belinda Noble, welcome to the show.
Hello, Nelli. Thanks so much for having me.
It has just been so great seeing this report roll out across the media, across political circles, and all of the reception that it's had. And tell me, it finds that more than 260 coal, oil and gas funded programs have been rolled out and reaching kids through early learning all the way through to their career pathways. If you could explain in 30 seconds to a parent why they should be concerned about this, what would you say?
Every child deserves an education free from undue corporate influence. You know, that's it in less than 30 seconds. We see it not so much as a climate issue, but as a fairness issue and an education issue. These guys should not be brainwashing our kids. Simple.
Absolutely not. So you've used the term petrogrooming to describe this practice. Can you unpack what this petrogrooming looks like in practice and why you chose that term in particular?
Well, grooming is when you try and establish a trusted relationship with a child. And we think this is a part of the fossil fuel toolkit here, basically. So they establish trust and an emotional connection with children in the sort of settings in which they learn and play and grow. And these settings often, or these programs, they can start in kindergarten, they go all the way through school, and they end in often career pathways. So in a way, when they get to the children very young, obviously we know children, under 6 are extremely impressionable.
I've got one.
You've got one. They're very, if they have favourable emotions towards a fossil fuel company, more likely that later in life they might consider a job in that sort of industry. And in that sense, it's grooming them to be the supporters of the fossil fuel industry and the workers of the fossil fuel industry in the future.
That is absolutely diabolical. And it reminds me of the way that McDonald's sponsors Little Athletics in New South Wales, or at least certainly it did when I was growing up, and that very positive brand relationship that children have with McDonald's. And so can you unpack what this sort of access to children's developing brains, what sort of power dynamic that creates down the track?
Yeah, that's super interesting. So we know that kids under the age of 6, for example, don't have the ability to distinguish marketing messages from other messages that they might receive from trusted sources, such as teachers or sports coaches or whatever. So what is happening is they're getting favourable emotions, favourable information about the fossil fuel industry at a really young age. How that manifests later in life, I guess, is dependent on quite a lot of factors. We're not seeing, it's turning kids into climate deniers or anything like that. But like you said, with the McDonald's example, it's just that favourability. It's just that warm, fuzzy feeling that you might get when you see a brand and you don't even know why. It's often subconscious. And there's actually been research about this done in Canada, where it found that children who were targeted by marketing, particularly brand marketing, very early in their lives went on to have more favourable intentions towards that brand later in life. Other example is obviously Dolomite, which is the school banking program that helped.
I had one of those accounts.
You had one of those? I had the little box.
Yeah, the little yellow. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
I closed that when I was 25. I had that account for 25 years and I stayed with the Commonwealth Bank until I learned that they were funding coal, oil and gas projects.
Yeah, well, they weren't just doing that. They were marketing to you at school, right? They were using
That's appalling.
They were using schools as an acquisition channel in order to get more customers. And this is what it does. This is what it's all about. It's not overt. It's so subtle. And I'm sure that a sports coach or a sports manager or the manager of a museum or something like this wouldn't think about it that way when they're going, oh, good, this fossil fuel company is giving me a chunk of money. But if you look at it systematically, as we've done in this report, possibly for the first time, we've looked at the whole system of targeting children, and it's really, really clear what the tactics are.
And it's just so diabolical. It's like, I think about my own child, and, that's a 4-year-old brain. And I think about my role as a parent in shaping that very, very plastic little mind and giving it the absolute best start in life, and how they're like little sponges. Like, kids just absorb everything they can. And like, my kid is learning 3 different languages at the moment on top of English, right? Like, he's learning Spanish at school, he learns Te Reo Māori at home, and we're learning Indonesian because we spend a lot of time over there. And I think about how much their little brains can absorb at that age and how they're learning like 50 to 100 new words a day. What on earth is that doing to their long-term perception of the industry that is ultimately locking in the worst possible future for them?
Yeah, because like it affects, your values, not just your views, and I think that's kind of key as well. Where we see, it's sort of a cultural colonialism, like colonizing your brain, where they're coming in and you learn those values that are associated with extraction. They're associated with industry, with big industry. It's those sorts of values that people could be taking on as well, apart from just whether you believe in climate change or want to dig for oil when you're older. Yeah, we do hope that there is a Senate inquiry into this that will have a deeper look into what effect it is having on children, because it hasn't been done before. There's a couple of developments now in academic world where there's some really great academics looking at this. Petropedagogies is the official term.
Petropedagogies, I love it. So for those of you who aren't familiar with early childhood education terminologies, a pedagogy is a teaching framework. That is incredible. What did you come up with that? Petropedagogies?
This is some of the academics who helped us with this study have been looking at this, and they're putting this new framing around it and this new understanding around these sorts of programs, which we think warrant greater investigation. Now it's giving us our own view of a different view on these kinds of programs.
Wow. And so you mentioned you're keen to see a Senate inquiry into this. What are the ultimate outcomes you'd like to see from that Senate inquiry? What do you want that inquiry to uncover?
Well, we want it to uncover what's happening here. We're just going on what we can find on the internet, right? So we don't know really how widespread this is. We can take a good guess. So we found 260 programs. But we're very sure that it's going to be well over 300. We could substantiate 54 million in funding, but we're pretty sure a Senate inquiry could find it's hundreds of millions over sort of 10 years invested by fossil fuel companies in marketing to children. So the Senate inquiry needs to look at exactly what's happening. Let's get a proper picture of what's happening here. Let's look at the cumulative effect on children and children's minds and children's learning. Let's also look at the gaps in governance. So, no one's actually got an overview of these programs right now. So how are they slipping through? How is it not being monitored in any way? And also transparency. It's pretty much impossible to get a copy of an agreement between a fossil fuel company or a school or a museum or even the Department of Education in some states, but they exist, but we can't get them. So we'd really like to know what museums, schools, departments of education, museums, sports clubs are signing away in return for coal, oil and gas money.
So what do you think? I'm a member of Parents for Climate Action, and I often consider, when I'm working on campaigns as well, like that sense that folks have when they don't do the kind of work that you and I do, where we make our living by trying to solve the climate crisis. Often folks can feel incredibly powerless. So if for the parents listening to the show today, what direct pathways could they take? What steps can they take to inquire about these programs that might be around their children and to potentially challenge them? What would you recommend?
I think the first step is the school principal. In a
Mm-hmm.
lot of states, they're the gatekeeper for what sort of commercial agreements can be entered into. Except in the ACT, where they have banned fossil fuel sponsorships in state schools. But everywhere else,
Wait,
yeah.
fancy that. I love the fact that the ACT is so progressive in so many ways. It's got the highest percentage of public servants of any other state or territory in the country, and they're the most progressive. Like, it's amazing what Labor and the Greens can do in partnership when they actually work together. Hey.
I know, right? I know. It's pretty great, and we hope they expand that as well. But yeah, so I think the school principal is really the first step.
Mm-hmm.
Write to them, let them know your concerns. Also, if you have a Labor MP in your area, send them a letter, please, because we are trying to get support for a Senate inquiry. We're hoping in the next term of Parliament.
I spoke about this on my social media on the day that you released the report, and I had a number of people write to me. One of them was a teacher, and she mentioned that they even can't really escape big tech in their schools, and they have these things called like e-whiteboards or electronic whiteboards, and YouTube is embedded into these electronic whiteboards, and they can't even protect their children from things like gambling ads if it might pop up. Say whoever's YouTube account gets a sports bet ad served to them, like they can't even escape advertising in schools, full stop. And so for our listeners who aren't familiar with Comms Declare, Belinda is a long-term communications professional, and she set up her organisation to essentially counter the enormous enabling that the communications industry does of the harms of the coal, oil and gas industry. And so there is a pledge that you can take. I've taken that as a communications professional, that I will never work with the fossil fuel industry. And they also work to mobilize agencies and essentially remove that social license. Like, nobody will work with the tobacco industry or the big vaping industry as it is now anymore. And Belinda's organisation really seeks to have that same impact on the coal, oil and gas industry, and just making sure that all of these people, like us with these brains that understand how people work, that understand how to market to people, that understand how to sell products, are using those skills for good, not for evil. And so with your understanding, Belinda, of how advertising works in Australia and what we've just heard about that person who wrote into me, how can we better protect our children even from advertising in schools?
Gosh. Look, we receive, 2,000 advertising messages a day. The advertising industry, I think, is around $1 trillion globally. This is a massive industry, and we're not anti-advertising, by the way. We have our members.
Oh, we've worked on advertising projects together, you and I.
Yeah. We love advertising.
Yes.
So look, the issue for us is very much harmful advertising, and most people, when they think of harmful advertising, they're thinking about cigarettes, alcohol, gambling, possibly junk food. And we argue that coal, oil and gas should be added to that list. So, most government bodies, for example, won't allow those advertising from harmful products on their property, because a lot of governments own advertising property. And we're saying include coal, oil and gas on your list of prohibited products. And we've done that in, I think, 23 councils now, and the ACT, where they've actually done that. So that's one step, is to actually ban their ads from public spaces. But in schools, advertising is actually prohibited around a lot of school areas, particularly, sex work and stuff like that. Like, outdoor advertising companies won't allow those sorts of ads around schools.
Not that there's anything wrong with sex work. We just have limitations on where we're going to put the ads for it.
Yeah, just not at school anyway. But in terms of going into schools, Look, it's really interesting. There's just no rules around it. I mean, it's so, it's so concerning. That you're in a
Mm,
trusted environment,
mm.
and obviously banks have been banned from going into schools in a lot of states now. They wouldn't
Oh,
accept
good.
food advertising. Yeah, but why ban banks from running school programs, but not
But
the
not the fossil fuel industry.
yeah, not the products that are actually going to, cause enormous harm and are already causing
Mm,
enormous harm to this generation and the
mm.
next. So,
It's something. I had our friend Katan Joshi on the show earlier in the season, and I'm profoundly grateful to him for reframing the way I talk about the coal, oil, and gas industry as the most harmful industry in the world. Because it is. And I've been challenged on this. But what about the weapons industry? It's like, yes, but weapons are harmful if and when they're detonated. I'm sure there's plenty of harm in the, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, the mining processes and whatever. And let's not forget the deep sea mining they want to do for the laser guided missiles and stuff like that. It's all terrible. But the coal, oil, and gas industry is harmful on a planetary level. It doesn't give a shit if you live in the northern beaches of the Northern Territory. It is coming for you, and it's coming for all of us indiscriminately.
yeah, and you can't opt out. I mean, people say, "Oh, it's not as doesn't kill as many people as smoking." Well, globally, fossil fuel pollution does kill more people than smoking, but
Mm. Oh, I believe that.
yeah, it does because the particulates, the burning fossil fuels, the cars. I mean,
Mm.
it's responsible for approximately 11,000 premature deaths in Australia every year. But even
Jeez.
even not those direct, pollution problems, then you've got the planetary problems, like you say. Um,
Mm.
it's just that weirdly we don't think about that, and I think it's even on something like death certificates. You record sort of heat as the cause of a death, right? Or
Mm.
respiratory failure as a cause of a death. No one's putting, climate change down, for example. So,
Mm.
we're only just starting to
Yeah.
come to grips with the idea that, fossil fuels are an enormous health problem, apart
Mm.
from being, an economic problem and an environmental problem and a mental health problem,
Mm.
obviously.
Speaking of mental health, I live in Victoria, and earlier this year, I live about 30 kilometres out of the CBD, and it was 47 degrees outside my house. And I have never experienced heat like that in my life. And I recall from the moment that forecast came through that we would see a day exceeding 46 degrees in, outer Melbourne, all the way through to I was so tense. I was so anxious, and I felt this incredible anger. Like I hadn't felt anger towards the coal, oil and gas industry like that since I lived in Sydney through the Black Summer fires, and the sky was orange for 3 months straight. And I remember locking down the house and thinking, this was just after that Climate Council report came out that was like, here are all of the suburban areas that are now in danger of bushfires because of climate change. And I did a bit of media for them on that, talking about my experience living in, outer almost regional Melbourne and being concerned about extreme heat and also grass fires. And here I was locking up my house for a 47-degree day, praying that the power didn't go out because I don't yet have a battery. And then sure enough, grass fires erupted. And so I was literally living what we had predicted 3 days prior in the media. And that kind of the mental health toll that week of extreme weather took on me, knowing that this is deliberately being done to us. Like climate change is not happening to us. It's being done to us by these people who have names and addresses that are executives within the coal, oil and gas industries. It is an extraordinary mental health challenge.
Yeah, and a particularly, and this is one of the things that I think the academics in this area are looking into, the cognitive dissonance when you're
Mm.
doing a lesson from Woodside, which teaches you to drill for oils using, Vegemite and
Vegemite
sprinkles,
sandwich.
Sure, but yeah, and, and you got some Woodside people, and they're really nice, and, that's fun, and the teacher's really grateful, but then, also, we know this company is doing enormous damage to our climate. Yeah, the mental health damage is something that a lot of academics are looking at now, not just the mental health problems, but obviously coping with this extraordinarily extreme weather that we all have to cope with, but also
Mm.
the cognitive dissonance for a kid who's being taught, how useful coal and gas is for the future in school, while also simultaneously having to hold the thought that, oh, it's causing climate change and that's going to cause enormous, problems for me during my life. So, how are you meant to hold those two ideas in your head, particularly
Mm. Mm.
you're in a school environment and, you're being told that fossil fuels are part of the future and you're being told that fossil fuels are greening, there's a lessons called greening coal that was, put
Oh,
together
you're kidding
with that.
me.
So, there's lots of examples, Nelly.
And the thing, I have a tremendous amount of empathy for kids in that space because I wrote some of the materials that one of the education companies in early childhood education, Twinkle, used to teach children in an early childhood setting about climate change. And so that was one of the more interesting communications challenges I've had because something that, we know we need to do is we need to build agency into, the work that we do. But what agency does a 4-year-old kid have? And I realized because so much of it is, we have to guide people towards systemic change and not, reinforcing, BP and Ogilvy's concept of your carbon footprint and reducing that. I'm going to do an entire episode on that. If you want to come on that one, let's do it because fuck, what a case study. Not reinforcing this, this rubbish idea of reducing your carbon footprint, but actually giving them agency. And I realized when I was writing these materials, everything I was saying was ask your parents too, talk about your parents with blah, say this to your parents, get your parents to blah, because children have such little agency in terms of actually making a difference. And I see this in my own kid. He's 4 and he already has this sense of environmental justice. Mummy, look, there's garbage. Someone left rubbish. That's a bad decision. Because we don't say you're a bad person. We say it's a bad decision now. And he goes, that's a bad decision, Mummy. Can I pick it up? And it's I got to sort of, we can't be constantly picking up rubbish because we're never going to get anywhere. But what agency, when we think about kids in this environment where they're being taught this stuff from the fossil fuel industry, what sort of agency can we try to support children with, do you think?
That's a great question. But before I get onto that, I just want to make one point. There's a lot of political discourse from organisations like the Institute of Public Affairs, which say that teaching kids climate change is upsetting for them and is causing trauma and is unnecessary. But one thing that we've found, or one thing that the researchers have found, is that actually teaching them the truth is more important than anything else. Kids know what the truth is. They're not dumb, right? You can't tell them it's not happening. Clearly it's happening. You've got, 47, degree days. It's over 45 in Paris, which is unthinkable, even 10 years.
It's unbelievable.
So, telling them the truth, I think, is the one most important thing. But then how do you give them agency? Gosh, I guess we're all sort of hoping that kids will, come together and come up with such better ideas than any of us. I do think it's difficult, and I certainly don't envy the position that they're in. Obviously, when they're voting, they can toss out the political parties that are deniers. But I don't know. What do you think? What agency can we give younger kids?
It's so funny because when I was pregnant, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change released its Working Group 3 report, which for those of you who are listening who don't follow the climate science, that was the big bad one that came out that we were all just sobbing over because it was it was just some really terrible science that had come to light. And I was 5 months pregnant when I was working on that, and I'd had an embargoed draft sent to me because of my role at Greenpeace. And I just had this baby in my tummy thinking, for the very first time, I could see this happening on a timeline, and a timeline that actually made some sense to me because I could plot how old he would be at each point there. And I coped with that in the same way that I cope with a lot of things that are just totally overwhelming and out of my control, with dark humor. A lot of people asked me, you work on climate change, how do you feel about having a kid? I was actually interviewed for The Age about it. And I just had to start joking, well, he's going to build the drawdown machine. He's going to be the one that saves us. Someone's got to figure it out. Someone's got to save us. But in terms of the question about agency and empowerment, I think back to my own origin story, and I remember the very first moment I learned about climate change. And there was this terrible period of like flooding rains in New South Wales in the 90s, and the Warragamba Dam, I think it was at risk of overflowing. And so for the very first time, we'd sort of been encouraged to use a lot of water. And I remember going, as a water baby, I was just like, sweet. I was having these big, long showers, playing with the hose in the backyard, having the time of my life. And my dad came in and he said, hey, I need you to get out of the shower. And I said, but you said we're allowed to use lots of water, Dad. And he said, yes, but it's coal that's heating that water. And when we burn coal, it acts like a blanket around the earth and it's heating up the planet. I think I was like 7 years old, right? And that has totally stuck with me, that moment. I was in our little house in Haberfield where that was an affordable place to rent, which is a really long time ago. And then, I remember that combined with being exposed to really empowering television programs. So for me, the show du jour was Captain Planet. And I would sit down and watch these 5, quite diverse kids from different countries like get together and fight the bad guys who want to loot and plunder. It was such a gateway drug for me. And I think that
really?
Having that entertainment that was really empowering about systemic change. And they had the, recycle and bring your own plastic bag message at the end of each episode, but it was about systemic problems, and it framed these polluting industries as the bad guys. And that's how I talk to my son about it. I use these sort of frameworks that he's familiar with when I talk about things that are fundamentally unfair. Things like why we go and say free Palestine in the city on Sundays, and because there are some bad guys doing some really bad things to kids, and these frameworks that work within his little mind. So he goes, okay, I'll put my Spider-Man outfit on and we'll go say free Palestine to save the children, right? And so I think that what I think is really missing in that empowerment piece for kids right now is some fiction, some engaging fiction that gives them that sense of power and gives them that sense of agency. Personally, I want to see a reboot of Captain Planet. I think that's something that works within the frameworks that kids understand and makes them feel empowered is sorely missing right now.
Afraid to sound probably a bit old. I haven't seen Captain Planet. So I can't comment on the Captain Planet. Look, what I will say is, the information's there, right? The information's there. It's Australia's party to the Paris Agreement, which says that, which does dictate that schools should be teaching climate. It's one of the things that we've agreed to under the Paris Agreement. So the information's there. I think it's about turning it into action. And I think when you're younger, individual action's great, but when you get older, let's do the group action, because that's when you can really move the dial.
Absolutely. And so that actually moves me on to another question I wanted to ask. So your report highlights that many of these sponsored programs emphasize that individual responsibility piece that we were talking about earlier, while downplaying, the systemic problems, the corporate problems. How is that messaging shaping kids' sense of who is to blame and who has power when it comes to climate change?
Yeah, 100%. That's such an important point. They frame climate in such a narrow way. It's something to be fixed by technical solutions, even though we know those solutions don't exist, or it's something that, we can do by, recycling our garbage or something like that. It's taught in this such a narrow way, without the context, and that's part of the reason is because it's part of the science curriculum, I think, often. It's delivered in curriculum adjacent materials, linked to, mathematics and science. So this is part of the reason. But I think, what it does to kids is that it affects their framing of it as, I don't know, not just as a problem to be solved, but as a problem that can only be solved in certain ways. And I
Mm. And
bet you bottom dollar, none of these materials, and I've seen a lot of them, none of them say the best way to combat climate change is to stop mining gas or stop burning petrol. It's not even there. They'll say this is the cause, but they don't put it up as a possible solution. So the framing of it is super, super, super important.
I mean, frames, inform how we interpret the whole world. When I'm teaching people about framing, I put natural plants and then I put dirty power stations. And we talk about those two frames, and then I drop the word gas in between both of those. And they go, frames.
Yeah.
So you mentioned before this STEM activity where kids were building models of like offshore drilling with Vegemite, with sprinkles, with bread. What does that tell us about how early and how subtly this kind of normalization of this incredibly harmful industry starts?
Okay, so that was primary school, but we have seen
How old?
I think it was, don't quote me, I think it was probably about 9 or 10 for that one, so late primary school for that one. There is a similar program I have to tell you about, which is also teaching kids to drill for oil, but that was using chocolate milk and Tim Tams, which is, another.
Oh, like a Tim Tam Slam?
Yeah, like a Tim Tam flat. Yeah, you call it that. Yeah, so that the Tim Tam's
Oh my
basically
God.
like a rock.
But that's
And so you
diabolical because
learn about how to bring the chocolate, which is the oil, through the rock.
But that's diabolical because
it's so evil.
not only are they going for kids in this incredibly, vulnerable time of their life, but they're also working with dopamine receptors. Because if kids are getting a double chocolate hit of chocolate milk and a Tim Tam through an activity
Happy day,
that's so it's disinformation, it's propaganda, and they're mining kids' dopamine at the same time. That is diabolical.
It's you got to give them credit. They're doing their jobs. But I think the earliest we've seen, for example, we've had a kindergarten that's been sponsored by Shell. Or the Shell has donated money to the kindergarten, and the kindies put up thanks Shell QGC, which is their gas company in Australia, up on their boards. We've seen the resources industry body, which is sort of 50% coal, has produced booklets for preschool kids about mining with a little animal, cute little animal in a hard hat and a high vis, talking about how important mining is. So, yeah, it's pretty early. And that's why we call the report From Cradle to Career, because it really is going over all of childhood and young adulthood.
So, Belinda, your report is ultimately about children's futures. And how do you connect this cradle to career strategy to the very real pain of kids facing climate anxiety, health impacts, and extreme weather themselves, and their shrinking sense of what their future can be?
Well, we do hope this is something that the Senate inquiry will look into. It wasn't really covered by our report because we're sort of in PR and advertising. We're not experts in children's cognition or mental health. I think it's a new area of study. So I wouldn't like to say anything definite. beyond what I've already said about how, it's framing the problem of climate very narrowly, not giving children all of the information, not giving them information that is not tainted by corporate influence. And in particularly in areas where there is a lot of extraction going on, I'm concerned that children aren't getting other information to round out their view of climate change and the impacts that they're going to feel ongoing. So that's obviously in areas in Western Australia, New South Wales and Queensland predominantly, where most of these programs are. The most are in Western Australia. It does concern me that the fossil fuel companies are so embedded in the education system that the children are not getting information that could help them survive a changed climate future, or indeed could send them to careers that would be more useful for the future, and in fact will still be here in the future, because coal mining will not be here 30 to 50 years from now. So yeah, that's my concern.
Wow. And we've got time for one more question, Belinda. If this report lands in the way you hope it will, what does a future free of the influence of the coal, oil and gas industry look like for our children in 10 years' time? And who needs to move to make that a reality? Is it parents, teachers' unions, teachers, agencies, politicians? What does it look like, and who needs to help us get there?
Well, the first thing the government could do would be to tax gas exports at 25%, because then we would have the money to make up all the shortfalls in the education system, and then
Wouldn't that be nice?
No school would have a reason to take this money, to take, this dirty money from the fossil fuel industry. So that's the first thing that I'd like to see. The second thing is that we have a tobacco-style ban on fossil fuel advertising and sponsorships, particularly when it comes to childhood settings. And what would that look like in the end? What would the outcome be? Oh, look, it's just a beautiful world, Nelly. It's just a beautiful world where kids are just taught the truth by experts, not by, dirty companies with vested interests in continuing to pollute the atmosphere.
I love that vision of that world. Belinda, it's been a joy having you on the show. Thank you so much. And where can people find you online and find the report?
Yep. comsdeclare.org. The report Cradle to Career is there. Or you can go to fossiladban.org and sign the petition for a fossil fuel advertising ban.
Belinda Noble, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for sticking around with us for the show today. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe, leave a review and send it to a friend. You can find us on Instagram at The Nelli Stevenson Show, and I'm everywhere else just as Nelli Stevenson. Have a great day and we'll see you next time.